My name is Joaquin Rivera, and I'm a postal worker who survived the first 72 hours of the zombie outbreak. When the power grid died and people started turning into mindless cannibals, my 12 years of delivering mail became the difference between life and death. I knew every back road, every house, every person in my community. While others panicked in the darkness, I used my mail truck and route knowledge to rescue survivors and uncover a government conspiracy that goes deeper than anyone imagined. Before we start the video, let us know what country you are tuning in from in the comment section below. Perhaps we will make a story there. Let's begin. My name is Joaquin Rivera, and for 12 years I've been delivering mail to the same rural routes outside Denver, Colorado. People always thought being a postal worker was boring, predictable work. They joke about rain or shine, about how we kept showing up no matter what. What they didn't understand was that those 12 years taught me something invaluable. I learned every back road, every shortcut, every person's routine within a 50-mile radius. I knew who lived alone, who had medical conditions, who kept spare keys under flower pots. I had master keys to buildings most people never even noticed. That knowledge, that boring, predictable job, became the only reason I'm still alive to tell you this story. October 15th, 2024 started like any other Tuesday morning, except for one major difference. The power had been out for 3 straight days. They called it the biggest solar storm in recorded history, something about magnetic fields and electrical grids that I didn't pretend to understand. What I did understand was that my mail truck was one of the few vehicles still running in the neighborhood. The electromagnetic pulse had fried most of the newer cars with their computerized systems, but my old truck with its simple engine kept chugging along like nothing had happened. I remember thinking how quiet everything was that morning. No humming air conditioners, no television chatter bleeding through windows, no familiar sounds of suburban life. Just an eerie silence that made my skin crawl. But I had a job to do, and the Postal Service motto wasn't just words on a wall to me. Neither snow, nor rain, nor heat, nor gloom of night stays these couriers from the swift completion of their appointed rounds. Even with the power out, people needed their mail. Social security checks, medication deliveries, important documents. Especially the elderly folks on my route who depended on me for more than just letters. The first sign something was seriously wrong came when I reached Maple Street. Mrs. Chen lived at house number 1243, a small blue ranch house with a meticulously maintained garden. In all my years delivering to her address, she had never, not once, missed picking up her mail. Not during the blizzard of 2022 when I had to use snowshoes to reach her porch. Not when she had the flu 2 winters ago. Not even when her husband passed away and she was so grief-stricken she barely left her bedroom for weeks. She always collected her mail by 9 in the morning. But that Tuesday her mailbox was still full from the previous day. And the day before that. I knocked on her front door, harder than usual. The October morning was crisp, and my breath formed small clouds as I waited. Behind me, Maple Street stretched empty and silent in a way that felt wrong. I called through the mail slot, telling her I had her social security check. That's when I heard the crash from inside her house, followed by what sounded like furniture being overturned. I asked if she was all right, and that's when the front door started rattling violently, as if someone was throwing themselves against it from the inside. The deadbolt held, but I could hear fingernails scraping against the wood with desperate intensity. Through the frosted glass panel, I saw a shadow moving erratically, jerking back and forth like a broken marionette. My hand instinctively moved to the pepper spray on my belt, a habit from dealing with aggressive dogs over the years. Now, looking back, I realized there had been warning signs for days that I should have picked up on. Since the blackout started, people had been acting strange. More aggressive, more paranoid. I'd noticed it during my rounds. Mr. Patterson had snapped at me for no reason when I'd asked if he needed help with his generator. The Jenkins family had their curtains drawn tight, and wouldn't answer their door even though I could hear them moving around inside. Mrs. Williams had complained that her neighbors were making noise all night, keeping her awake, but when I'd listened, I couldn't hear anything unusual. The stray dogs had been acting different too. There were more of them than usual, and they seemed more aggressive. Their eyes looked glazed over, unfocused. I'd seen 3 of them just standing in the middle of the road near the elementary school, not moving even when I honked my horn. Something about the way they stared at nothing made my stomach turn, but I'd chalked it up to the stress of the power outage affecting the animals too. Then there were those CDC notices I'd been delivering for the past few months. Official-looking envelopes with government seals, going to medical facilities and health departments. I wasn't supposed to read mail, obviously, but sometimes addresses would smudge or envelopes would tear, and I'd catch glimpses of phrases like dormant pathogen monitoring and activation triggers under stress conditions. At the time, I'd figured it was just routine bureaucracy, the kind of paperwork that government agencies sent around to justify their existence. But standing there on Mrs. Chen's porch, listening to that inhuman scratching, those warning signs started connecting in my mind in ways that made my blood run cold. That's when the screaming started. Not from Mrs. Chen's house, but from everywhere. Up and down Maple Street, voices rose in terror and pain. Windows shattered, doors slammed. In the distance, toward downtown Denver, I could see a column of black smoke rising into the morning sky. I backed away from Mrs. Chen's door, my heart hammering as the scratching grew more frantic. Whatever was wrong with her, whatever was happening in those houses where people were screaming, I knew with absolute certainty that I needed to get back to my truck and get out of there. But as I turned toward the street, I saw something that made my blood freeze in my veins. Mr. Davidson from House 1247 was stumbling across his front lawn. He was wearing his postal uniform, the same navy blue I wore, but it was torn and stained with something dark that I didn't want to identify. Mr. Davidson was a retiree who'd worked for the Postal Service for 30 years before I'd even started. He was the gentlest man I'd ever known, someone who always offered me coffee on cold mornings and asked about my daughters. But his face was wrong, twisted with an expression of pure rage I'd never seen on him before. When he looked at me, I saw that his eyes had gone completely white. Not cloudy like cataracts, but white like milk, with no pupil visible at all. His mouth was hanging open, and I could see that his teeth were stained with blood. He made a sound that wasn't quite human, somewhere between a growl and a moan, and then he started running toward me with a speed that shouldn't have been possible for a 70-year-old man. I ran to my mail truck faster than I'd ever moved in my life. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition, but the engine turned over on the first try like it always did. Mr. Davidson slammed into the side of the truck just as I threw it into drive, his fists pounding against the metal with enough force to dent it. I could see his face through the window, those horrible white eyes staring at me with nothing human left in them. I floored the accelerator and got out of there, using the back roads I knew like the back of my hand. Oak Street to Birch Avenue, then cutting through the old industrial district where the roads were too narrow for most traffic. Behind me, I could hear more screaming, more breaking glass, more sounds that civilization wasn't supposed to make. My radio was crackling with static, so I tried to reach dispatch first, then other postal workers, then anyone who might be listening. All I got was static mixed with distant screams and what sounded like gunfire. Once, I thought I heard someone shouting, "Don't let them bite you," before the transmission cut to static again. I tried every frequency I knew, every emergency channel, every communication method I'd been trained to use. Nothing but chaos and silence. That's when I started thinking strategically instead of just reacting with panic. 12 years of postal work had taught me more than just where people lived. I knew who was elderly and might need help. I knew which houses had medical supplies because I'd delivered prescriptions. I knew which buildings had the strongest security, which roads would be clogged with abandoned cars, which routes would give me the best chance of avoiding whatever was happening in the populated areas. My first stop was the pharmacy on Elm Street. I could see people barricaded inside, and I knew the pharmacist, Dr. Sarah Martinez, from years of delivering her business mail. I parked my truck as close to the entrance as possible and ran to the door. Dr. Martinez recognized me through the glass and let me in quickly, slamming the deadbolt behind me. Inside were 6 other people, all looking terrified and confused. Dr. Martinez filled me in on what they'd observed. The infected, that's what she called them, were spreading some kind of virus through bites. Once bitten, people transformed within minutes into those things I'd seen. They were drawn to noise and movement, but their behavior was predictable. They didn't seem capable of complex thought or planning. They just followed basic instincts to hunt and bite. But here's what was really interesting. Dr. Martinez told me she'd been getting unusual requests from the CDC for months. Requests for data about patients showing signs of aggression, sleep disorders, and behavioral changes. She'd been asked to report any unusual patterns in prescription requests for antipsychotics and sedatives. At the time, she'd assumed it was research for some study about urban stress or mental health trends. One of the people in the pharmacy, a man named Tom who worked at the hardware store, told me something even more disturbing. He said his store had received several large orders for unusual combinations of items over the past month. Medical supplies, heavy-duty locks, emergency rations, things that didn't make sense together unless someone was preparing for exactly the kind of crisis we were facing. The orders had come through government purchase cards, but when he tried to follow up on delivery dates, he'd been told the orders were classified. I stayed with them long enough to help reinforce their barricades and share what I knew about back roads for potential escape routes. But I had other people to check on, elderly folks on my route who lived alone and wouldn't have anyone coming to help them. I took some basic medical supplies from the pharmacy with Dr. Martinez's permission and got back in my truck. My next stop was Mrs. Rodriguez at House 815 on Sycamore Street. She was 83 years old, lived alone since her husband died, and had diabetes that required daily medication. I knew she kept her spare key under the ceramic frog by her back door because I'd helped her get in once when she'd locked herself out. More importantly, I knew she had a landline phone that might still work even with the power out. I approached her house carefully, watching for any signs of the infected. The street was eerily quiet, with several abandoned cars sitting in the middle of the road with their doors hanging open. I could see scratches on some of the car windows and dark stains on the pavement that I tried not to think about too hard. Mrs. Rodriguez answered my knock immediately, as if she'd been waiting by the door. She was scared but unharmed, and she told me something that made my blood run cold. Her grandson Miguel had been staying with her for the past week because he'd been having what she called episodes. Aggressive outbursts, trouble sleeping, periods where he didn't seem to recognize her. She'd been planning to take him to the doctor after the power came back on. But Miguel had disappeared the morning the screaming started. She'd found her back door standing wide open and blood on the kitchen floor. She hadn't seen him since, but she'd been hearing scratching noises coming from the crawl space under the house. She was too scared to investigate, and honestly, after what I'd seen that morning, I couldn't blame her. I used her landline to try calling my ex-wife in Denver to check on my daughters, but the call wouldn't go through. I tried the police, fire department, anyone who might have information about what was happening on a larger scale. Most numbers just rang without answer. But I did reach someone at the county sheriff's office who told me they were overwhelmed and advised everyone to stay indoors and avoid contact with anyone showing signs of aggressive behavior. That's when I heard the first government emergency broadcast that actually contained useful information. It came through on Mrs. Rodriguez's battery-powered radio, cutting through the static with an automated message. The broadcast confirmed that a viral outbreak was spreading through bite transmission, that military quarantine zones were being established, and that civilians should remain in place and wait for evacuation instructions. But there was something about that broadcast that bothered me. It was too polished, too prepared. Most emergency broadcasts I'd heard before were clearly improvised, with officials stumbling over words and providing conflicting information. This one sounded like it had been written and recorded well in advance, just waiting for the right moment to be transmitted. I helped Mrs. Rodriguez pack essential medications and convinced her to come with me to a more secure location. As we were leaving her house, I made a decision that would prove crucial in the hours to come. I went back to my mail truck and pulled out the official documents I'd been carrying for delivery to the county health department. I'd been trained never to open mail that wasn't addressed to me, but this was a survival situation, and I needed to understand what we were really facing. The documents were labeled Project Blackout and contained contingency plans for maintaining communication and supply networks during a widespread population event. The language was deliberately vague, but the level of detail was staggering. Maps of safe zones, lists of priority personnel, protocols for using postal workers as unofficial emergency responders. Because of our knowledge of local communities and our access to government communication systems. What made my hands shake as I read was the date on the documents. They'd been printed 3 weeks before the solar storm hit, 3 weeks before the outbreak began. This wasn't a response to an unexpected crisis. This was the implementation of a plan that had been ready and waiting. Mrs. Rodriguez and I made it to what I'd decided would be our temporary base of operations, the old elementary school on Pine Street. The building was solid brick construction with limited access points, and I had master keys that would get us inside. More importantly, I knew the building's layout from years of delivering mail there, including the locations of the kitchen, first aid supplies, and the backup generator in the basement. As we settled in for what I suspected would be a long night, I tried my radio again, cycling through every frequency I knew. That's when I finally made contact with another postal worker, a woman named Janet who worked routes about 20 miles east of my area. She was holed up in a rural post office with several other survivors, and her report matched what I'd been seeing. Infected spreading through bites, government broadcasts that seemed too prepared, and a growing sense that this outbreak wasn't the accident it appeared to be. But Janet told me something else that made my situation even more urgent. She'd been monitoring military radio frequencies, and she'd overheard transmissions about implementing something called Protocol 7 if the infection spread beyond initial containment zones. She didn't know what Protocol 7 involved, but the tone of the military personnel discussing it suggested it wasn't something any of us wanted to experience. As darkness fell on that first day, I sat in the elementary school with Mrs. Rodriguez, listening to the sounds of chaos growing louder in the distance. The glow from fires was visible on the horizon, and the intermittent sounds of gunfire suggested that people were fighting back against the infected with varying degrees of success. But I also heard something else that gave me hope. Other radio transmissions from postal workers, truck drivers, emergency responders, and ordinary citizens who were organizing, sharing information, and refusing to give up. That's when my radio crackled with a transmission that changed everything. A voice claiming to be military, asking for my location, and promising immediate evacuation assistance. The voice was professional, authoritative, exactly what you'd want to hear in a crisis situation. But something about it felt wrong. Maybe it was the timing, coming right after I discovered those Project Blackout documents. Maybe it was the way the voice seemed a little too eager to know exactly where I was. I was about to respond when the transmission cut out abruptly, replaced by static, and then silence. Mrs. Rodriguez looked at me expectantly, waiting for me to answer the radio and bring us the rescue we desperately needed. But instead, I turned the radio off and told her we needed to be very careful about who we trusted, because I was starting to suspect that the people who were supposed to be helping us might be the same people who had been preparing for this outbreak long before it began. The first 12 hours had taught me that everything I thought I knew about the world was wrong. But they'd also taught me that my 12 years of postal work had given me exactly the skills I needed to survive. I knew the territory, I knew the people, and most importantly, I knew how to keep moving when everyone else was paralyzed by fear. The question was whether that would be enough for what was coming next. As dawn broke on my second day in this nightmare, I made a decision that probably saved dozens of lives. Instead of waiting for that mysterious military contact to call back, I was going to use my postal knowledge to mount rescue operations for the most vulnerable people on my route. Mrs. Rodriguez had fallen asleep around 3 in the morning, exhausted from fear and stress, but I'd stayed awake monitoring radio transmissions and planning my next moves. The infected seemed less active during daylight hours, though I couldn't be sure if that was because they were actually less dangerous or just because it was easier to see them coming. Either way, I had a window of opportunity to reach people who were trapped in their homes, running out of supplies, or simply too elderly or disabled to help themselves. These were people I'd been checking on for years, delivering medications and social security checks, sometimes being the only human contact they had all week. My first priority was the Thompson farm, about 5 miles north of the elementary school. Bill and Martha Thompson were in their 70s, and Martha had been recovering from hip surgery when the outbreak started. I knew from delivering their medical supplies that she was barely mobile and would need help getting to safety. More importantly, I knew their property layout from years of navigating their long gravel driveway, and knew they had a storm cellar that would make an excellent temporary shelter. The drive to the Thompson farm taught me more about how this infection was spreading through the community. I saw abandoned cars everywhere, some with doors hanging open as if people had fled in panic. Others crashed into trees or ditches as if the drivers had lost control suddenly. But what really caught my attention were the houses with broken windows and doors that had been torn off their hinges from the inside. This wasn't just people fleeing from danger. This was people transforming inside their own homes and then breaking out to spread the infection further. When I reached the Thompson farm, I found Bill barricaded in the kitchen with Martha, both of them terrified but unharmed. They'd been listening to a battery-powered radio and had heard enough of the emergency broadcasts to understand that something catastrophic was happening, but they hadn't seen any infected directly. That changed when Bill told me about their neighbors, the Hendersons, who lived about a quarter-mile down the road. According to Bill, the Henderson family had come to their door the previous evening asking for help. The father, Jim Henderson, had been acting strangely for several days, becoming increasingly aggressive and violent. His wife Sarah and their 2 teenage children had been trying to get him medical attention, but with the power out and no way to contact emergency services, they'd been at a loss for what to do. Bill had offered to let them stay in his storm cellar for the night, but before they could make it across the yard, Jim had attacked his own family. Bill described watching in horror as Jim bit his wife on the arm, then turned on his children with the same savage intensity I'd seen in Mr. Davidson. Sarah Henderson had managed to get her kids to their car and drive away, but not before Jim had broken every window in their house trying to get to them. Bill hadn't seen what happened to Jim after that, but he'd been hearing strange noises coming from the Henderson property all night. This gave me crucial information about the infection timeline. Mrs. Rodriguez had mentioned her grandson Miguel having episodes for about a week before disappearing. The Henderson family had been dealing with Jim's behavioral changes for several days. Dr. Martinez at the pharmacy had been getting CDC requests about patients with aggression and sleep disorders for months. There was a pattern here that suggested this infection didn't just appear suddenly. It had been building in the population, dormant or barely noticeable, until something triggered it to become active. I helped the Thompsons pack essential supplies and convinced them to come with me to the elementary school, which I was starting to think of as our main safe house. Martha's limited mobility made the evacuation challenging, but I'd learned from years of postal work that the most important thing in any difficult situation was to stay calm and work methodically through problems one step at a time. As we were loading Martha into my mail truck, I heard something that made my blood run cold. It was coming from the direction of the Henderson property, a sound that wasn't quite human but wasn't quite animal either. A rhythmic moaning that seemed to carry on the wind, punctuated by what sounded like fists pounding against wood. I realized that Jim Henderson was probably still alive, still infected, and still trapped in his damaged house. The drive back to the elementary school gave me time to think about the bigger picture of what was happening. I'd now encountered or heard about at least 6 cases of people transforming into these infected creatures, and in every case, there had been warning signs days or even weeks in advance. Behavioral changes, aggression, sleep disturbances. This wasn't a sudden viral outbreak like influenza or food poisoning. This was something that had been incubating in the population for an extended period. When we arrived at the school, I made another discovery that deepened my understanding of the crisis. While helping Martha get settled in one of the classrooms, I found a stack of health department forms that the school nurse had been required to fill out over the past month. The forms were asking for detailed information about students showing signs of unusual behavior, including aggression, attention problems, and what the forms called dissociative episodes. What made these forms particularly disturbing was their timing and specificity. They weren't general health surveys. They were targeted inquiries about very specific symptoms that perfectly matched what I'd been observing in the infected. The forms were dated throughout September, weeks before the solar storm that had knocked out our power grid. Someone had been tracking these behavioral changes systematically, as if they were expecting exactly what was happening now. I tried my radio again, hoping to reach Janet or other postal workers who might have additional information. This time I was able to make contact with 3 different postal employees scattered across the region. Each of them reported similar patterns in their areas. Infected spreading through bites, government emergency broadcasts that seemed overly prepared, and a growing number of survivors who were organizing into small groups for mutual protection. But one of those postal workers, a man named Frank who worked routes closer to Denver, gave me information that made my personal situation much more urgent. He'd been in radio contact with survivors in the city, and the situation there was far worse than what we were experiencing in the rural areas. The high population density had allowed the infection to spread much faster, and entire neighborhoods had been overrun within hours of the first outbreak. Frank told me he'd heard from someone claiming to be at the hospital where my ex-wife worked, but the transmission had been cut short by what sounded like gunfire and screaming. He couldn't confirm whether my daughters were safe, but he warned me that attempting to reach Denver would be extremely dangerous, possibly suicidal. The main highways were reportedly clogged with abandoned vehicles and roving groups of infected. This created a moral dilemma that tore at my heart. My 2 daughters, 8-year-old twins named Sophia and Alina, were somewhere in Denver with their mother. Every instinct I had as a father screamed at me to get in my truck and drive straight to the city to find them. But I also had a growing group of survivors depending on me for leadership and protection, people who would probably die without the local knowledge and resources I could provide. That afternoon, I made my most difficult rescue attempt yet. I'd been monitoring emergency radio frequencies and had picked up a transmission from someone trapped in the rural medical clinic about 10 miles east of our location. The voice belonged to Dr. Patricia Williams, a physician I knew from delivering medical supplies to her clinic. She reported that she was barricaded inside with limited supplies and at least 12 infected surrounding the building. The medical clinic represented a crucial resource for our survival. Dr. Williams had medical training that could save lives, and the clinic contained medications and equipment we couldn't get anywhere else. but reaching her would require driving through territory that was potentially crawling with infected, and I'd be risking not just my own life, but the safety of everyone depending on me. I decided to make the attempt, but I took precautions based on what I'd learned about infected behavior. I waited until mid-afternoon when they seemed less active, planned a route that avoided main roads and populated areas, and prepared backup escape plans in case the primary route was blocked. Most importantly, I brought my pepper spray and had identified potential weapons in my mail truck, including a tire iron and a heavy flashlight. The drive to the clinic was like navigating through a war zone. I saw evidence of violence everywhere. Houses with doors torn off their hinges, cars that had crashed at high speed, dark stains on the pavement that I tried not to identify. But I also saw signs that people were fighting back and surviving. Some houses had been barricaded with furniture and plywood. Others showed evidence of defensive preparations, with broken glass and makeshift weapons scattered around entry points. When I reached the clinic, I found Dr. Williams exactly where she described, barricaded in the main examination room with the infected pounding on the doors and windows. The building's security was better than most residential homes, with reinforced doors and windows that had held against the infected assault. But it was clear that the barriers wouldn't last much longer. Getting Dr. Williams out required using tactics I'd never imagined I'd need to know. I used my mail truck's horn to draw most of the infected away from the building, then circled back to the rear entrance where I had a key from my postal route. The infected were drawn to noise and movement, but didn't seem capable of complex reasoning or planning, which made them predictable in some ways but terrifyingly persistent in others. Dr. Williams had been trapped in that clinic for over 18 hours, and the information she shared with me filled in more pieces of the puzzle about what we were facing. She'd been treating patients with behavioral symptoms for weeks before the outbreak, symptoms that perfectly matched what we'd been seeing in the infected. But what was most disturbing was that she'd been required to report these cases to the CDC, using specific codes that she'd never seen before in her 20 years of medical practice. According to Dr. Williams, the CDC had been tracking what they called presymptomatic behavioral indicators throughout the region for at least 2 months. Medical facilities had been instructed to watch for specific combinations of symptoms, including aggression, sleep disturbances, and what the official reports termed social disconnection episodes. Any patients showing these symptoms were supposed to be reported immediately using a special hotline that bypassed normal medical reporting channels. But here's what really made my hands shake as she told me this story. Dr. Williams had tried to call that CDC hotline several times over the past month to report patients who fit the criteria. Every time she called, she was told that her reports had been logged for monitoring and that she should continue normal treatment protocols. No additional instructions, no follow-up questions, no apparent concern about a potentially dangerous medical situation developing in the community. It was as if the CDC already knew exactly what was happening and was simply tracking its progress rather than trying to prevent or treat it. Combined with the Project Blackout documents I'd found in my mail truck and the overly prepared emergency broadcasts, the evidence was pointing toward a terrifying conclusion. This outbreak hadn't been an accident or a natural disaster. It had been anticipated, monitored, and possibly even engineered. During the drive back to the elementary school with Dr. Williams, I shared my growing suspicions about the government's role in the crisis. She confirmed that other medical professionals in the region had been reporting similar experiences with CDC monitoring and the unusual specificity of the symptoms they'd been asked to track. She also revealed something that made the situation even more urgent. According to medical reports she'd been required to file, children and teenagers seemed to be showing the presymptomatic behavioral indicators at higher rates than adults. The CDC had been particularly interested in tracking these cases in school-age populations, requesting detailed information about family medical histories and environmental factors that might be contributing to the behavioral changes. This information hit me like a physical blow because it meant my daughters could be at higher risk than I'd realized. 8-year-old children were exactly the demographic that seemed most susceptible to whatever was causing these transformations. If the infection had been spreading through Denver for weeks before becoming actively dangerous, Sophia and Alina could already be showing symptoms that their mother might not recognize as warning signs. When we arrived back at the elementary school, our small group of survivors had grown. Bill Thompson had used his amateur radio equipment to make contact with other people in the area, and 3 more families had made their way to our location seeking shelter and protection. This brought our total to 15 people, including 5 children, which made me realize that I was no longer just trying to survive. I was leading a community. The newcomers brought additional information about the scope of the crisis. The Patterson family had driven from a town about 30 miles south and reported that the infection was spreading rapidly through populated areas, but seemed less severe in rural locations with lower population density. The Morrison family had tried to reach the interstate highway to evacuate toward Colorado Springs, but found it completely blocked by abandoned vehicles and groups of infected. Most importantly, one of the new arrivals was a teacher named Rebecca Chen, who had been monitoring emergency radio frequencies from her car during the drive to our location. She'd picked up military transmissions that mentioned something called Protocol 7 and evacuation deadlines for civilian populations in affected areas. The transmissions weren't clear about what would happen to people who couldn't reach designated evacuation points, but the tone suggested it wouldn't be pleasant. That evening, as I was helping organize our expanded group and plan for the night's security, my radio crackled with another transmission from the mysterious military contact who had tried to reach me the previous day. This time the signal was clearer, and the voice was more insistent. The speaker identified himself as Colonel Martinez with the Colorado National Guard and claimed they were establishing secure evacuation points for civilian survivors. Colonel Martinez knew my name, my postal route number, and even the location of the elementary school where we'd taken shelter. He promised immediate evacuation to a secure military facility where we'd have food, medical care, and protection from the infected. All I had to do was provide our exact coordinates and remain at our current location until transport arrived. Everything about the transmission should have been reassuring. Military rescue, professional competence, a solution to our desperate situation. But something felt wrong about it, just like the emergency broadcasts that had seemed too polished and prepared. How did this colonel know so much about my specific location and circumstances? How had he gotten my radio frequency? And why was he so insistent that we remain exactly where we were instead of meeting at a more secure location? I looked around at the 15 people who were depending on me for leadership and protection. Families with children, elderly people like Mrs. Rodriguez and Martha Thompson, Dr. Williams with her vital medical knowledge. If I made the wrong decision, all of their lives would be at risk. But if I made no decision at all, we'd eventually run out of supplies and be overrun by the growing number of infected in the area. Before I could respond to Colonel Martinez, another voice broke into the transmission. It was Janet, the postal worker I'd been in contact with since the first day of the outbreak. Her voice was urgent, frightened, and she was broadcasting on an emergency frequency that cut through the military transmission. Janet's message was brief but terrifying. She reported that military units had arrived at her location that morning, claiming to be there for evacuation assistance. Instead of evacuating the survivors, the soldiers had separated them into different groups and loaded them into unmarked vehicles. Janet had managed to hide during the operation and had watched the vehicles drive away in the direction of a facility that didn't appear on any civilian maps. She warned anyone listening not to trust military contacts offering evacuation assistance, and to avoid revealing their locations to anyone claiming government authority. Her transmission ended abruptly with what sounded like vehicles approaching her position, and I never heard from Janet again. The silence that followed Janet's warning was broken by Colonel Martinez trying to reestablish contact with me. His tone had changed, becoming more demanding and threatening. He claimed that failure to cooperate with evacuation procedures would result in my group being classified as non-compliant civilians subject to alternative protocols. When I didn't respond immediately, he warned me that I had until sunrise to provide our coordinates or face the consequences of refusing government assistance. I turned off my radio and gathered the other adults in our group to explain the situation. We had less than 12 hours to decide whether to trust a military contact who knew too much about us, or to assume that the same government that had been monitoring this outbreak for months was now trying to round up survivors for reasons that probably weren't in our best interest. The discussion that followed revealed just how much the people in our group had learned to distrust official authority over the past 2 days. Bill Thompson mentioned that the emergency broadcasts had been encouraging people to gather in large groups at designated locations, but nobody had heard from anyone who'd actually reached those locations. Dr. Williams pointed out that her medical reports about pre-symptomatic patients had been sent to government agencies that seemed more interested in tracking the problem than solving it. Rebecca Chen, the teacher who'd been monitoring radio transmissions, shared something that clinched our decision. She'd been recording fragments of military communications throughout the day, and when she played them back, we could hear references to specimen collection, behavioral analysis, and Phase 2 implementation. These didn't sound like rescue operations. They sounded like research projects using human subjects. As midnight approached on my second day in this nightmare, I made a decision that would determine whether our group survived or became part of whatever experiment the government was conducting. We would not be waiting for Colonel Martinez's deadline. Instead, we would use the hours before dawn to relocate to a more secure location using routes that only I knew, routes that wouldn't appear on any military maps or government databases. But first, I had to deal with a problem that threatened to tear our group apart from the inside. One of the people who joined us that evening, a man named Steve Morrison, had been acting increasingly agitated and aggressive as the night wore on. His wife had mentioned that he'd been having trouble sleeping and had been showing signs of what she called stress-related behavioral changes for about a week. As I watched Steve pacing around the classroom where we'd gathered, muttering angrily about government conspiracies and the need to fight back against the infected, I realized with growing horror that we might have a much more immediate problem than military evacuation teams. Steve Morrison was showing exactly the same pre-symptomatic behaviors that had preceded every transformation I'd witnessed, and he was trapped in a building with 14 other people, including 5 children, with nowhere to run if he turned into one of those things. The next few hours would test everything I'd learned about leadership, survival, and the terrible choices that people have to make when civilization collapses around them. Because I was about to discover that sometimes the greatest danger doesn't come from the infected monsters outside your walls. Sometimes it comes from the person sitting right next to you, someone you thought you could trust, someone whose transformation you never saw coming until it was almost too late. The confrontation with Steve Morrison taught me the hardest lesson I'd learned since this nightmare began. Sometimes the people you're trying to save become the very thing you're fighting against, and sometimes there's no good choice, only the choice that keeps the most people alive. Steve had been getting more agitated as the night progressed, muttering about fighting back and showing the same pre-symptomatic behaviors I'd observed in everyone who'd transformed. When his wife Linda tried to calm him down, he shoved her hard enough to knock her into a desk. That's when I knew we had a problem that wouldn't solve itself. I'd seen this progression before. The aggression, the paranoia, the way he kept scratching at his arms like something was crawling under his skin. Steve Morrison was maybe 6 hours away from becoming one of those things, and he was trapped in a building with 14 other people who couldn't defend themselves if he transformed. I made the decision that still haunts my dreams. I told Steve that I needed his help checking the building's perimeter security, and I led him outside into the school's courtyard. Once we were away from the others, I confronted him directly about what was happening to him. I explained what I'd observed about the transformation process, the behavioral warning signs, and what would happen to him and everyone else if we didn't deal with this situation immediately. Steve's reaction confirmed my worst fears. Instead of denying the symptoms or asking for help, he became violently angry, accusing me of trying to murder him to steal his supplies. His eyes had that same wild look I'd seen in Mr. Davidson and Jim Henderson, and when he lunged at me, I barely managed to avoid his attempt to bite my arm. The postal uniform that had protected me before became a liability as Steve grabbed the thick fabric and tried to pull me close enough to infect me. I used my pepper spray, the same canister I'd carried for 12 years to deal with aggressive dogs. It stopped Steve's attack but didn't calm him down. If anything, it seemed to accelerate whatever was happening to him. His movements became more erratic, more animal-like, and the sounds he was making weren't entirely human anymore. That's when I realized that the transformation wasn't always a gradual process. Under stress or physical trauma, it could happen much faster. I had to make a choice that no training or life experience had prepared me for. I could try to restrain Steve and hope he didn't complete the transformation, risking my own life and the lives of everyone in the building. Or I could do what needed to be done to protect the group, even though it meant crossing a line I'd never imagined crossing. The choice was made for me when Steve broke free from the effects of the pepper spray and came at me again, this time moving with the inhuman speed and coordination I'd seen in the other infected. I used the tire iron from my mail truck. I won't give you the details because some things don't need to be described, but Steve Morrison never made it back inside the elementary school. His wife Linda was devastated, but when I explained what had been happening to him and what would have happened to all of us if I hadn't acted, she understood. Understanding and forgiving are two different things, though, and I could see in her eyes that something between us had changed forever. That incident broke our group's sense of security and forced us to confront the reality that anyone could be infected without knowing it. Dr. Williams established a protocol for monitoring everyone's behavior and physical condition, but we all knew that early symptoms could be subtle and that someone could be hiding their condition out of fear or denial. Trust became a luxury we couldn't afford, even among people who'd been working together to survive. The stress of the situation was affecting everyone differently. Mrs. Rodriguez had become almost catatonic with fear, requiring constant reassurance and assistance with basic tasks. Bill Thompson was channeling his anxiety into obsessive preparation, constantly checking and rechecking our security measures and supply inventory. The children were having nightmares and asking questions about their missing parents that none of us could answer honestly. But it was Rebecca Chen, the teacher who'd been monitoring radio transmissions, who brought us information that changed our entire understanding of what we were facing. She'd been recording military communications throughout the night, and when she analyzed the recordings, she discovered something that made my blood run cold. The military units in our area weren't just responding to the outbreak. They were implementing something called Phase 2 of an operation that had been planned long before the first person showed symptoms of infection. According to the transmissions Rebecca had intercepted, Phase 2 involved the systematic collection of survivors from rural areas for what the military termed behavioral analysis and genetic sampling. The survivors weren't being evacuated to safety. They were being transported to research facilities where they would be studied to understand how the infection spread and why some people seemed immune while others transformed rapidly. The recordings also revealed that our area had been designated as a control zone, where the infection would be allowed to spread naturally without intervention, providing researchers with data about the virus's behavior in different population densities and demographic groups. We weren't just fighting for survival. We were laboratory rats in an experiment we'd never consented to participate in. This information explained why Colonel Martinez had been so insistent about knowing our exact location, and why he'd seemed to know so much about our situation. The government wasn't trying to rescue us. They were tracking us as subjects in their research project, and our refusal to cooperate had probably flagged us as what the military called non-compliant specimens, requiring special collection procedures. Rebecca's analysis of the military communications also revealed something that made our situation much more urgent. According to the transmissions, Phase 2 had a specific timeline. Research collection would continue for 72 hours after initial outbreak confirmation, after which the area would be subjected to sanitation protocols to prevent further spread of the infection. The timeline suggested we had less than 24 hours before whatever those sanitation protocols involved would be implemented. I didn't want to speculate about what military sanitation protocols might mean in the context of a viral outbreak, but the terminology suggested it wouldn't be pleasant for anyone still in the affected area. Whether it involved chemical agents, controlled burns, or something else entirely, it was clear that the government's plan didn't include long-term survival for people like us who'd refused to cooperate with their collection efforts. That morning, I made the decision to abandon the elementary school and move our group to a location that wouldn't appear on any government maps or databases. I've been thinking about this possibility since the first day of the outbreak, and I knew exactly where we needed to go. About 15 miles north of our current location was an abandoned mining facility that had been closed since the 1980s. The facility was built into the side of a mountain with limited access points, natural barriers that would make it defensible, and most importantly, it was completely off the grid. I knew about the mining facility because I'd been delivering mail to the caretaker who lived in a small house near the entrance for the past 3 years. The caretaker, an elderly man named Frank Kowalski, had been showing me around the facility during my visits because he was proud of the work he'd done maintaining the buildings and equipment. Frank had been a mining engineer before retirement and had turned the facility into his personal project, keeping everything in working condition even though the mine hadn't been operational for decades. The facility had everything we needed for long-term survival. Underground sections that would provide protection from weather and potential airborne threats, a natural water source from an underground spring, stored supplies that Frank had accumulated over the years, and most importantly, a location that was isolated enough to avoid both infected and government collection teams. Moving 15 people, including children and elderly individuals, across 15 miles of potentially dangerous territory required careful planning and coordination. I used my postal knowledge to identify a route that avoided main roads and populated areas, following back roads and service paths that most people didn't know existed. We would travel during daylight hours when the infected seemed less active, and we would move in small groups to avoid attracting attention. Dr. Williams raised concerns about moving Mrs. Rodriguez and Martha Thompson, both of whom were in fragile physical condition and might not survive the stress of relocation. But I pointed out that staying at the elementary school meant certain capture by military collection teams, while the mining facility offered our only chance of avoiding whatever sanitation protocols were being planned for our area. The journey to the mining facility became a masterclass in using local knowledge for survival. I knew which bridges could handle the weight of vehicles and which had been damaged in previous floods. I knew which farms had aggressive dogs that would bark and attract infected, and which had owners who'd always been friendly to postal workers. Most importantly, I knew the timing of local patterns like when the logging trucks used certain roads and when the rural electrical crews made their rounds. We encountered infected during the journey, but the rural setting made them easier to avoid than they would have been in populated areas. The infected seemed to follow predictable patterns, congregating around areas where they'd found food sources or been attracted by noise. By moving quietly and avoiding the areas where I'd previously observed signs of infected activity, we were able to reach the mining facility without any direct confrontations. Frank Kowalski was still alive when we arrived, though he'd been dealing with his own challenges over the past few days. He'd observed infected wandering through the area, but had avoided contact by staying inside his house and keeping quiet. Frank was thrilled to have company and immediately began showing us around the facility, explaining the layout and the resources available for our use. The mining facility exceeded my expectations as a survival location. The underground sections included workshops with tools and equipment, storage areas with preserved food and emergency supplies, and living quarters that had been maintained in excellent condition. The natural spring provided unlimited fresh water, and the facility's isolated location meant we could establish security perimeters without worrying about government surveillance. But Frank also shared information that added a new dimension to our understanding of the outbreak. As a retired mining engineer, he'd maintained contact with colleagues throughout the region, and several of them had reported unusual government activity in their areas over the past month. Survey teams had been taking soil and water samples near old mining sites, and government contractors had been asking questions about underground facilities and their access points. According to Frank, the government interest in mining facilities had been explained as environmental monitoring for old contamination, but the timing and the specific questions being asked suggested a different purpose. It appeared that the government had been identifying underground locations that could serve as research facilities or storage sites for materials related to the outbreak. This revelation meant that our choice of the mining facility as a hiding place might not provide the security I'd hoped for. If the government had been cataloging underground facilities throughout the region, they might already know about Frank's mine and could include it in their collection operations. We might have bought ourselves time, but we hadn't necessarily found a permanent solution to our survival problems. That afternoon, while helping Frank organize the facility's resources for our extended stay, I discovered something that connected directly to the project blackout documents I'd found in my mail truck. Hidden in Frank's workshop was a filing cabinet containing correspondence between the mining facility and various government agencies dating back several months before the outbreak. The correspondence revealed that the government had been quietly acquiring rights to use abandoned mining facilities throughout the region for what they termed emergency storage and research operations. The paperwork was deliberately vague about the specific purpose of these operations, but it was clear that the government had been planning to use places like Frank's mine for activities related to the outbreak long before the first person showed symptoms of infection. Frank explained that he'd been approached by government representatives who offered to pay him a substantial fee for temporary use of his facility. He'd refused because he didn't want strangers disturbing his life's work, but he'd kept the paperwork because the legal language had been so unusual. According to the documents, the government claimed authority to commandeer the facility under emergency powers if Frank didn't cooperate voluntarily. Reading those documents while sitting in the facility they described gave me a chilling sense of how thoroughly the government had planned for this outbreak. They'd identified survival locations, tracked potential immune individuals, monitored pre-symptomatic populations, and prepared collection and research protocols. This wasn't a response to an unexpected crisis. This was the implementation of a plan that had been years in the making. That evening, as our group settled into the mining facility for what we hoped would be a long-term stay, I tried to contact other postal workers to share information about government collection operations and safe locations. The radio communications I received painted a grim picture of the situation throughout the region. Most of the postal workers I'd been in contact with had either been captured by military collection teams or had gone silent, suggesting they'd either been killed or had been forced to abandon their radio equipment. The few contacts I was able to maintain reported that the government collection operations were becoming more aggressive and systematic. Military units were using sophisticated tracking equipment to locate survivor groups, and they seemed to have detailed information about potential hiding places throughout the region. Several postal workers reported that collection teams had appeared at locations that should have been unknown to outside authorities, suggesting that the government was using information sources we hadn't identified. One postal worker, a woman named Diana who worked routes about 40 miles east of our location, provided information that made our situation even more desperate. She reported that areas that had been sanitized under the government's phase 2 protocols were being sealed off with military checkpoints that shot anyone trying to enter or leave. The sanitation process appeared to involve the complete elimination of all biological material in the affected areas, whether infected or not. According to Diana's observations, the government's plan seemed to involve containing the outbreak by sacrificing entire regions and everyone in them. The research collection operations were designed to gather data and specimens before implementing final protocols that would leave no evidence of what had really happened. We weren't just fighting for survival. We were fighting to prevent our own government from covering up the evidence of their involvement in creating this crisis. As I sat in the mining facility that night, listening to radio reports of friends and colleagues being captured or killed, I realized that our small group of survivors had become something more significant than I'd originally understood. We weren't just trying to stay alive until rescue arrived. We were preserving evidence of government conspiracy and witness testimony that could eventually expose the truth about how this outbreak had been planned and implemented. The weight of that responsibility was almost overwhelming. 15 people, including 5 children, were depending on me for protection and leadership. But beyond that, we might be among the last free witnesses to what really happened during the first 72 hours of an outbreak that had been engineered by the very people who were supposed to protect us. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as the government's timeline for Phase 2 collection operations reached its conclusion and the sanitation protocols began. But tonight, for the first time since this nightmare started, we were safe, hidden, and united in our understanding of what we were really fighting against. The question was whether that would be enough to survive what was coming next, and whether we would live long enough to tell the world the truth about what our own government had done to us. The radio crackled with one final transmission before I turned it off for the night. It was a weak signal from someone claiming to be at the rural elementary school where my group had been staying earlier. The voice reported that military vehicles had surrounded the building and were demanding that anyone inside surrender for immediate evacuation. When no one responded, the vehicles had departed, but not before the soldiers had planted what looked like explosive devices around the building's perimeter. Our decision to abandon the elementary school had probably saved our lives, but it also meant that 15 other people who might have sought shelter there would find only a trap waiting for them. The government wasn't just collecting survivors for research. They were eliminating evidence and witnesses, making sure that no one would be left to contradict their official story about what had caused the outbreak and how they had responded to it. The third day in the mining facility started with a radio transmission that changed everything. At dawn, Rebecca Chen picked up an emergency broadcast from the rural elementary school where we'd originally planned to establish our long-term base. A teacher named Miss Patterson was trapped inside with 12 children and 3 other adults, surrounded by infected and running out of time. The school we'd abandoned to avoid government collection teams had become exactly what I'd hoped it would be, a refuge for people with nowhere else to go. Miss Patterson's transmission was weak and intermittent, but her message was clear. The infected had been drawn to the school by the sounds of children crying and had surrounded the building sometime during the night. The group inside had barricaded themselves in the library, but the infected were breaking through windows and doors with increasing persistence. They had maybe 6 hours before the barriers failed completely, and after that, 15 people, including a dozen children, would be torn apart by those things. This created the most difficult decision I'd faced since the outbreak began. Our group was finally safe, hidden in a location that the government didn't know about, with supplies and defenses that could sustain us for weeks or even months. Leaving the mining facility to attempt a rescue operation would risk exposing our location, depleting our resources, and potentially getting all of us killed. But abandoning children to die when I had the knowledge and capability to save them went against everything I believed about responsibility and community. I called a meeting of all the adults in our group to discuss the situation. The debate that followed revealed how much the stress of survival had changed all of us. Bill Thompson argued that we couldn't risk our established safety for people we didn't know, especially when any rescue attempt would probably fail and leave us all dead. Dr. Williams pointed out that we had limited medical supplies and couldn't treat serious injuries if the rescue went wrong. Even Martha Thompson, usually the most compassionate person in our group, questioned whether we could afford to take such a massive risk. But Frank Kowalski, who'd been quietly listening to the discussion, offered a perspective that changed my thinking about the situation. As someone who'd worked in mining rescue operations for 30 years, he understood better than anyone what it meant to risk your life to save people who were trapped. He pointed out that the elementary school represented more than just 15 potential victims. It was a symbol of whether our community would maintain its humanity or allow fear to turn us into the kind of people who could listen to children crying for help and choose to do nothing. The decision I made that morning defined who I was going to be for the rest of this crisis. I couldn't save everyone, and I couldn't guarantee that any rescue attempt would succeed. But I could use the knowledge and skills I'd developed over 12 years as a postal worker to give those children the best possible chance of survival. Even if it meant risking everything we'd worked to build at the mining facility. The rescue plan I developed drew on every aspect of my postal experience. I knew the layout of the elementary school from years of delivering mail there, including the locations of multiple entrances, the building's structural weaknesses, and the maintenance areas that most people didn't know existed. I knew the roads and terrain around the school, which would be crucial for approaching without being detected by either infected or potential government surveillance. Most importantly, I still had the master keys that would allow access to parts of the building that would be impossible to reach otherwise. Dr. Williams insisted on coming with me, arguing that medical expertise would be essential if anyone had been injured during the siege. Frank volunteered his knowledge of building structures and emergency procedures. Rebecca Chen wanted to bring radio equipment to coordinate the rescue and maintain contact with our base. But I made the difficult decision to limit the rescue team to just myself and Dr. Williams, with Frank remaining at the mining facility to coordinate communications and provide backup support if needed. The journey back to the elementary school took us through territory that had changed dramatically since we'd left. The infected had spread throughout the rural area, and I could see evidence of their presence everywhere. Abandoned vehicles with doors torn off, houses with broken windows and dark stains on the walls, farm animals that had been killed and partially consumed. The infection was transforming the entire landscape into something that looked like a war zone. But I also noticed patterns in the infected behavior that gave me hope for the rescue mission. They seemed to congregate around food sources and areas with high activity, but they didn't maintain organized patrols or systematic coverage of territory. This meant that careful movement and noise discipline could allow us to avoid most encounters, especially during daylight hours when they appeared less active. When we reached the area around the elementary school, I was horrified by what we found. The building was surrounded by at least 30 infected, maybe more, all focused on trying to break through the barriers that Miss Patterson's group had erected. The infected were taking turns throwing themselves against doors and windows with mechanical persistence, and I could see that several access points were already showing signs of structural failure. The scene reminded me of every zombie movie I'd ever watched, except this was real, and those were real children inside who would die horribly if I couldn't figure out how to get them out. The infected weren't the slow, shambling creatures from old horror films. They moved with purpose and coordination, and while they weren't capable of complex planning, they were incredibly persistent and surprisingly strong. My postal knowledge of the building became crucial for developing an approach strategy. The main entrances were completely blocked by infected, but I knew about a maintenance entrance on the north side of the building that connected to the heating and cooling systems. The entrance was hidden behind a utility shed and wouldn't be visible to the infected unless they specifically searched for it. More importantly, it led directly to the basement level, from which we could access the library where Miss Patterson's group was barricaded. Getting to the maintenance entrance required crossing about 50 yards of open ground, while avoiding detection by 30 infected and potentially government surveillance. Dr. Williams and I waited until the infected were focused on their assault on the main building, then used a route that took us through drainage ditches and behind outbuildings to approach the utility shed without being seen. The maintenance entrance was locked, but my postal master keys included access to utility areas throughout the school district. Opening the door felt like the most dangerous moment of the entire rescue, because any sound could attract the infected and trap us in the building with no escape route. But the door opened silently, and we were able to slip inside without being detected. Moving through the basement of an elementary school while infected creatures pounded on the floors above us was probably the most terrifying experience of my life. Every step seemed to echo, every breath seemed too loud, and I kept expecting infected to come crashing through the ceiling at any moment. But my knowledge of the building's layout allowed us to navigate directly to the stairwell that would take us to the library level. When we reached the library, I could hear Miss Patterson's voice through the barricaded door, trying to keep the children calm while the infected continued their assault on the building. I identified myself through the door and explained that Dr. Williams and I were there to evacuate everyone to a safe location. The relief in Miss Patterson's voice was overwhelming, but she warned me that one of the adults in her group had been bitten during the initial attack and was showing signs of transformation. This created a complication I hadn't anticipated. The bitten man, someone named Gary who worked as a janitor at the school, was becoming increasingly agitated and aggressive as the infection progressed. Miss Patterson had managed to restrain him, but she didn't know how much longer she could maintain control. We had a potential infected person inside the group we were trying to rescue, and if he completed his transformation during the evacuation, he could kill everyone we were trying to save. I made the decision to deal with Gary before beginning the evacuation. It was the same kind of impossible choice I'd faced with Steve Morrison, but this time I had Dr. Williams to help assess the situation and provide medical expertise. When we opened the barricaded door, I could see immediately that Gary was in the late stages of transformation. His eyes were losing focus, his movements were becoming erratic, and he was making the same inhuman sounds I'd heard from other infected. Dr. Williams confirmed that Gary was beyond medical help and would complete his transformation within minutes. Miss Patterson understood the situation, but was devastated by the choice we had to make. Gary had been a beloved member of the school staff, someone who'd spent years taking care of the building and helping children. But he was no longer Gary, and keeping him with the group would mean everyone's death. I handled the situation as quickly and quietly as possible, using methods I'd learned from previous encounters with infected. The children didn't see what happened, and Miss Patterson helped maintain their focus on preparing for evacuation. But I could see in the teacher's eyes that something fundamental had changed in her understanding of what survival meant in this new world. The evacuation itself required using every aspect of my knowledge about the school's structure and my experience with moving groups efficiently. I knew which hallways would provide the best cover from infected observation, which exits would allow quick access to vehicles, and which routes would minimize our exposure to potential government surveillance. The maintenance corridors that I'd used to enter the building became our primary evacuation route. Moving 12 children and 3 adults through a building, surrounded by infected required coordination and discipline that most people wouldn't have been capable of under normal circumstances. But Miss Patterson had maintained excellent control over her group, and the children followed instructions with the kind of focus that only comes from genuine terror. Dr. Williams helped manage the medical needs of people who'd been trapped without adequate food or water for over 24 hours. The most dangerous part of the evacuation was getting everyone from the building to the vehicles we'd positioned for escape. This required crossing the same open ground that Dr. Williams and I had used to approach the maintenance entrance. But now, we had 15 people, including children, who couldn't move as quickly or quietly as adults. Any noise or sudden movement could attract the infected and turn our rescue into a massacre. I used a distraction technique that drew on my understanding of infected behavior patterns. While Dr. Williams led the evacuated group toward our vehicles, I circled around to the opposite side of the building and created noise that attracted most of the infected away from our escape route. This left me temporarily isolated with a large group of infected between me and safety. But it gave the others the opportunity they needed to reach the vehicles without being detected. Getting back to my own vehicle required using every evasion technique I'd learned over the past 3 days. The infected were drawn to the noise I'd created, but they weren't capable of organized searching or tactical thinking. By moving carefully and using cover effectively, I was able to reach my mail truck and begin the drive back to the mining facility with our expanded group of survivors. The return journey with 15 additional people created logistical challenges I hadn't fully anticipated. We now had vehicles that were overcrowded and moving more slowly than before, people who were exhausted and potentially in shock, and children who needed constant reassurance and care. Most importantly, we had a much larger group that would be harder to hide and would require significantly more resources to sustain. But the information that Miss Patterson shared during the drive back changed my understanding of the outbreak timeline and the government's involvement. As a teacher, she'd been required to fill out the same health department forms about student behavioral changes that I'd found at other schools. But she'd also been contacted directly by CDC representatives who'd visited the school to interview specific children who'd shown signs of what they called pre-infection behavioral indicators. According to Miss Patterson, the CDC representatives had been particularly interested in children from families with specific genetic backgrounds and medical histories. They'd taken blood samples from several students under the pretense of routine health monitoring, and they'd asked detailed questions about family mental health histories and exposure to environmental factors. The visits had occurred over several weeks leading up to the outbreak, as if the CDC had been tracking the development of the infection in real time. This information confirmed my growing suspicion that the outbreak hadn't been accidental or unexpected. The government had been monitoring and possibly even engineering the crisis from the beginning, using schools and medical facilities to track the spread of whatever agent was causing the transformations. The children we just rescued weren't just victims of a random disaster. They were subjects in an experiment that had been planned and implemented with their parents' knowledge or consent. When we arrived at the mining facility, Frank and the others had prepared space for the additional survivors, but our expanded group created new challenges for long-term survival. We now had 29 people, including 17 children, in a facility that had been designed for much smaller occupancy. More critically, we had limited medical supplies for treating people who'd been traumatized by days of siege conditions, and we had no way of knowing whether any of our new arrivals might be carrying the infection. Dr. Williams established a quarantine protocol for evaluating the new arrivals, but we all knew that the infection could have an extended incubation period that wouldn't be detectable through immediate observation. Anyone who'd been exposed during the siege at the elementary school could potentially transform days or weeks later, creating the same kind of internal threat that we'd faced with Steve Morrison and Gary. That evening, as I was helping integrate our expanded group into the mining facility's security and resource management systems, Rebecca Chen received a radio transmission that made our successful rescue feel hollow. Military units had arrived at the elementary school shortly after our evacuation and had found evidence of our presence. According to the intercepted communications, the government now knew that survivors were operating in the area with detailed knowledge of local facilities and access to master keys. The transmission indicated that our rescue operation had compromised our security at the mining facility. The government would begin systematic searches of all potential hiding places in the region, using the evidence from the school to narrow their focus. They knew they were looking for a postal worker with master keys and detailed local knowledge, which meant they would eventually identify me specifically and focus their search on locations I would be likely to know about. Even worse, the military communications suggested that the timeline for implementing sanitation protocols had been accelerated in response to evidence of organized survivor resistance. Instead of having days or weeks to establish our long-term survival, we might have hours before the entire region was subjected to whatever final measures the government had planned to eliminate evidence of their involvement in the outbreak. The successful rescue of 15 people from the elementary school had saved their lives, but it had also exposed our location and accelerated the timeline for government retaliation. The moral victory of maintaining our humanity in the face of crisis was about to be tested by the practical reality of whether any of us would survive long enough for that humanity to matter. Frank gathered everyone in the main workshop area of the mining facility to explain our situation and discuss our options. We could attempt to remain hidden and hope that the government search teams wouldn't find us, but the evidence suggested that our discovery was now inevitable. We could attempt to evacuate to another location, but moving 29 people, including children, would be nearly impossible without being detected. Or we could prepare to defend our position, using the mining facility's natural advantages and our knowledge of the terrain to resist government collection efforts. The choice we made that night would determine whether our group became another footnote in the government's cover-up of the outbreak, or whether we would survive long enough to bear witness to the truth about what really happened during those first 72 hours. The successful rescue had proven that we could maintain our moral principles even under extreme pressure. Now, we had to discover whether those principles would be enough to keep us alive when our own government decided that we knew too much to be allowed to survive. The radio transmission that woke me at dawn on the final day changed everything we thought we knew about our situation. Rebecca Chen had been monitoring military frequencies throughout the night, and at 5 in the morning she intercepted a communication that made my blood run cold. The military wasn't just planning to implement sanitation protocols in our region. They were preparing to execute something called Protocol 7, which involved the complete sterilization of a 100-square-mile area encompassing our mining facility and every other potential hiding place in the region. According to the intercepted communications, Protocol 7 would be implemented at noon, giving us exactly 7 hours to either evacuate the area or accept that we would be eliminated along with all evidence of the government's involvement in the outbreak. The transmission mentioned aerial deployment of what they called biological neutralization agents that would eliminate all organic material in the target zone, infected and uninfected alike. The timeline was impossibly tight for evacuating 29 people, including 17 children, from a facility that was 15 miles from the nearest major road. But the intercepted communications also revealed something that gave me hope. Other survivor groups throughout the region had been monitoring the same military frequencies, and several were coordinating resistance efforts to prevent the implementation of Protocol 7. Most importantly, I learned that some of the postal workers I'd lost contact with over the past few days were still alive and had been working together to establish communication networks between survivor groups. A woman named Carmen Rodriguez, who worked routes about 30 miles west of our location, had managed to contact survivors throughout a three-county area and was coordinating a plan to expose the government's involvement in the outbreak before Protocol 7 could be implemented. Carmen's plan required survivor groups to simultaneously transmit evidence of government conspiracy on multiple emergency radio frequencies, creating a coordinated information release that would be impossible for authorities to suppress completely. Each group would share their documentation of government preparation for the outbreak, evidence of planned collection operations, and testimony about the systematic elimination of witnesses. The success of the plan depended on having enough survivor groups participate simultaneously to overwhelm the government's ability to jam radio communications or eliminate all the transmission sources. Carmen estimated that they needed at least 12 groups broadcasting from different locations at the same time to ensure that some of the information would reach outside authorities or media organizations that could expose the truth. Our group at the mining facility represented one of the largest and best organized survivor communities in the region, which meant our participation would be crucial for the plan's success. But it also meant that we would become a primary target for government retaliation once we began broadcasting evidence of conspiracy and cover-up. I called an emergency meeting of all the adults in our group to explain the situation and discuss our options. We could attempt to evacuate the area before Protocol 7 was implemented, but the chances of successfully moving 29 people to safety within 7 hours were minimal. We could remain hidden and hope that the biological neutralization agents wouldn't penetrate the underground sections of the mining facility. But we had no information about what those agents were or how effective our shelter would be against them. Or we could participate in Carmen's coordinated information release, using our radio equipment and the evidence we'd collected to expose the truth about the government's role in the outbreak. This option would almost certainly result in our discovery and elimination by government forces, but it would also ensure that our testimony and evidence would reach people who could eventually hold the responsible parties accountable. The debate that followed revealed how much our group had changed over the past 3 days. The people who joined us were no longer just trying to survive until rescue arrived. They understood that we were fighting against our own government, that rescue wasn't coming, and that our survival depended on preventing the implementation of protocols designed to eliminate all evidence of what had really happened. Frank Kowalski, who'd lived through government cover-ups during his mining career, was the first to advocate for participating in the information release. He pointed out that survival without justice would mean that the people responsible for the outbreak would be free to implement similar operations in the future. Dr. Williams supported the plan because her medical oath required her to protect public health, even if it meant risking her own life to expose a conspiracy that could lead to future outbreaks. Miss Patterson, speaking for the group of teachers and children we'd rescued from the elementary school, argued that our responsibility was to ensure that the truth about the outbreak would eventually reach the children's surviving family members. Even if we didn't survive the day, our testimony could provide answers to questions that would otherwise remain unanswered forever. The decision was unanimous. Our group would participate in Carmen's coordinated information release, transmitting everything we'd learned about government preparation for the outbreak, the systematic collection of survivors for research purposes, and the planned elimination of evidence through Protocol 7. We would use our final hours to ensure that the truth would survive even if we didn't. Preparing for the information release required organizing 3 days of evidence into a coherent testimony that could be transmitted within the limited time window available. Rebecca Chen worked with Frank to prepare technical documentation about the mining facility's government correspondence and the timing of official preparations for the outbreak. Dr. Williams compiled medical evidence about the pre-symptomatic monitoring and the CDC's advanced knowledge of the infection patterns. I focused on preparing testimony about the Postal Service's role in the government's preparation for the outbreak, including the Project Blackout documents, the master keys that had been distributed to postal workers for emergency use, and the communication networks that had been established to coordinate collection operations. Most importantly, I documented the systematic elimination of postal workers who'd refused to cooperate with collection efforts. As we prepared our evidence for transmission, I received radio contact from other postal workers throughout the region who were participating in the coordinated release. Each of them reported similar experiences with government preparation, collection operations, and the elimination of witnesses. The pattern was consistent across hundreds of square miles, indicating that the outbreak had been part of a massive, coordinated operation involving multiple government agencies. But the most disturbing information came from a postal worker named David Chen, who'd managed to infiltrate one of the government collection facilities by posing as a cooperative witness. According to David's report, the facilities weren't just collecting survivors for research. They were using the collected people as test subjects for developing more efficient versions of the infection agent, with the goal of creating biological weapons that could be deployed against foreign populations. The outbreak we'd experienced wasn't just a domestic conspiracy. It was a field test for biological warfare capabilities that the government planned to use internationally. The survivors who'd been collected weren't being studied to develop treatments or vaccines. They were being used to refine weapons of mass destruction that would make our experience look minor by comparison. This information transformed our understanding of what we were fighting against. We weren't just trying to expose a cover-up of a failed government operation. We were trying to prevent the development and deployment of biological weapons that could eventually kill millions of people around the world. The stakes of our coordinated information release had become much higher than any of us had imagined. At 10 in the morning, 2 hours before the scheduled implementation of Protocol 7, Carmen Rodriguez initiated the coordinated information release. Survivor groups throughout the region began broadcasting simultaneously on multiple emergency frequencies, sharing evidence, testimony, and documentation that painted a complete picture of government conspiracy and biological weapons development. Our group's transmission included my detailed testimony about Postal Service involvement in outbreak preparation, Dr. Williams's medical evidence about advanced monitoring of infection patterns, and Frank's documentation of government acquisition of underground facilities for research purposes. Rebecca Chen coordinated the technical aspects of the broadcast, ensuring that our signal reached the maximum possible range and was recorded for potential retransmission by other groups. The response to our coordinated information release was immediate and intense. Military units throughout the region began actively jamming radio frequencies and deploying electronic warfare capabilities to disrupt our communications. But Carmen's plan had anticipated this response, and survivor groups began using frequency-hopping techniques and backup communication methods to continue broadcasting despite the jamming efforts. More importantly, we began receiving confirmations that our transmissions were being received by outside authorities and media organizations. Emergency responders in neighboring states were recording our broadcasts and forwarding them to federal agencies that weren't involved in the conspiracy. International monitoring stations were picking up our signals and reporting them to foreign governments that had been concerned about unusual biological research activities in the United States. But our success in exposing the truth came at a cost that we'd expected but weren't prepared for. Military vehicles began arriving at the mining facility at 11 in the morning, 1 hour before the scheduled implementation of Protocol 7. The government had decided that our group represented too significant a threat to be eliminated through aerial biological agents, and was sending ground forces to ensure our immediate elimination. Frank had anticipated this possibility and had prepared the mining facility for defense against ground assault. The underground sections of the facility could be sealed and defended using choke points that would force attackers to advance through narrow tunnels where their numerical advantage would be minimized. The facility's multiple levels and complex layout would make it difficult for attackers to coordinate their assault or predict our defensive positions. But defending the facility meant accepting that we would probably not survive the encounter. Military forces had overwhelming advantages in firepower, training, and equipment that would eventually overcome any defensive positions we could establish. Our goal wasn't to defeat the government forces. Our goal was to delay them long enough for other survivor groups to complete their information broadcasts and ensure that the truth would reach people who could act on it. The siege of the mining facility lasted 3 hours and became the final chapter in our 72-hour fight for survival and truth. The children and elderly members of our group took shelter in the deepest underground sections, while the adults established defensive positions using tools and equipment from Frank's workshop. We weren't soldiers, but we were fighting for something more important than military victory. We were fighting to ensure that the truth about biological weapons development would survive even if we didn't. During the siege, we maintained radio contact with Carmen Rodriguez and other survivor groups, coordinating our defensive efforts with their ongoing information broadcasts. As government forces advanced through the facility, we continued transmitting evidence and testimony, using portable radio equipment to broadcast from multiple locations within the mining complex. The final hour of the siege coincided with reports from other survivor groups that their information broadcasts had been successful in reaching outside authorities. Federal agencies not involved in the biological weapons program had begun independent investigations based on our evidence. International monitoring organizations were demanding immediate inspections of suspected research facilities. Media organizations were preparing to release detailed reports about government conspiracy and cover-up. Most importantly, some of the government collection facilities where survivors had been held as test subjects were being raided by federal marshals and international observers. The people who'd been collected for biological weapons research were being freed, and the evidence of government atrocities was being preserved for future prosecution. When military forces finally broke through our defensive positions, they found a group of survivors who'd accomplished something that they probably hadn't expected. We'd successfully exposed a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of government, documented evidence of biological weapons development, and ensured that the truth about the outbreak would eventually reach the public despite all efforts to suppress it. The final transmission from our group was sent as government forces were advancing through the main workshop area of the mining facility. Rebecca Chen managed to broadcast a summary of our entire experience, from the first morning when I discovered infected on my postal route through the final siege of our underground shelter. The transmission included confirmation that other survivor groups had successfully completed their information releases, and that evidence of government conspiracy was already reaching outside authorities. In those final moments, I reflected on the strange journey that had brought a postal worker from rural Colorado to the center of a biological weapons conspiracy. 12 years of delivering mail had given me exactly the knowledge and skills needed to understand what was happening, organize resistance, and preserve evidence that would eventually expose the truth. The Postal Service motto that had guided my career took on new meaning in those final hours. Neither snow, nor rain, nor heat, nor gloom of night stays these couriers from the swift completion of their appointed rounds. Our appointed round had been to deliver the truth about government conspiracy and biological weapons development to people who could act on that information. Even facing elimination by our own government, we'd completed that delivery. The outcome of our 72-hour fight for survival extended far beyond what any of us had imagined when the outbreak first began. The evidence we'd collected and transmitted had exposed a conspiracy that led to congressional investigations, international sanctions, and the eventual prosecution of officials involved in biological weapons development. The people who'd been collected as test subjects were freed and received medical treatment for their trauma. More importantly, the exposure of the biological weapons program led to international agreements preventing similar research and development activities. The outbreak that had been designed as a field test for weapons of mass destruction became instead a catalyst for preventing future biological warfare operations. The children who'd survived the outbreak, including my own daughters who were eventually located safe in Denver, grew up in a world where the truth about government conspiracy was known and documented. They understood that ordinary people like postal workers, teachers, and doctors had risked everything to prevent biological weapons from being developed and deployed against innocent populations around the world. The mining facility where our group made its final stand became a memorial to the survivors who'd fought to expose the truth. Frank Kowalski's workshop was preserved as a museum documenting the evidence we'd collected and the methods we'd used to coordinate resistance against overwhelming government power. The postal workers who'd participated in the coordinated information release were honored as heroes who'd used their knowledge of local communities and communication networks to organize one of the most successful grassroots resistance movements in American history. Our understanding of local geography, building access, and community resources had been exactly what was needed to survive and resist in a crisis that had been designed to eliminate all witnesses. The story I've shared with you represents more than just a personal account of survival during a biological outbreak. It's a testament to the importance of ordinary people who understand their communities, maintain their moral principles under pressure, and refuse to be silenced when confronted with conspiracy and cover-up. The skills that made the difference during those 72 hours weren't military training or advanced technology. They were the knowledge that comes from years of serving a community, the relationships that develop through daily interaction with neighbors, and the determination to do what's right even when the cost is higher than anyone should have to pay. If you take anything away from this story, remember that the people who seem most ordinary are often the ones who have the knowledge and connections needed to resist tyranny and expose truth. Postal workers, teachers, doctors, and other community servants aren't just doing jobs. They're maintaining the networks of knowledge and relationship that make resistance possible when resistance becomes necessary. The fight for truth and justice doesn't always come from dramatic heroes in extraordinary circumstances. Sometimes it comes from someone who knows every back road in their community, has keys to buildings that others can't access, and understands that delivering the truth is just as important as delivering the mail.